Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Okay, we were looking at the Davidic covenant, and I said that there were a couple of select passages that I wanted to look at that show the premillennial necessity for the future fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. And we looked at Amos 9, we looked at Psalm 89, Jeremiah 23. There's one final passage, and that is Ezekiel chapter 37 and verses 24 and 25, but particularly look at the context of this passage. Ezekiel was a dramatic prophet. He liked to use object lessons, and in verses 15 to 17, you see one of those object lessons. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, "And you, son of man, take for yourself one stick and write on it for Judah and the sons of Israel." So Ezekiel took a stick. It was probably bigger than that, and I only have one of these, so I'm going to have to take a chapstick. But he takes one stick like this, and he writes on it for Judah and the sons of Israel, his companions. And then he took another stick, and he engraved on it, he wrote on it, look, for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel, his companions. So you have the two sticks that represent the two sections, the two divisions of the nation of Israel, Israel and Judah, the divided kingdom. Now, Ezekiel was writing when? Come on, where's your Old Testament history, your Old Testament? When was Ezekiel writing? During the Babylonian exile. During the Babylonian exile, in the 6th century, the northern kingdom, Israel, had already fallen. They had been carried away in captivity into Assyria. And the southern kingdom had also fallen. But you had a division in the kingdom from the days of Solomon's son Rehoboam. So he says, you take these two sticks. They represent the two divisions of the kingdom, right? And what are you going to do? You are going to, verse 17, join them for yourself one to another in one stick, that they may become one in your hand. So he takes the two, he takes the one and he puts it in the hand like this, and you see one stick. And that is symbolical of the fact that the two divisions of the kingdom, the divided kingdom, is going to be reunited. It is going to be reunited. And if you look at the following verses, we see how this is spelled out. In verse 21, what does it say? Thus says the Lord God, behold, I will take the sons of Israel from among the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from every side and bring them into their own land. Now, the tribes of Israel after the Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity were scattered over the world. The dispersion, it is called. After the Babylonian captivity, only a portion of the nation returned. What you have here is that God is going to bring them from every side and bring them back into their own land. And then in verse 22, and I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. I will make them one nation. That has never been fulfilled.
That has never been fulfilled.
And notice also in verse 22, and one king will be king for all of them, and they will no longer be two nations, and they will no longer be divided into two kingdoms. So you have the unification of the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. That has not happened. And you also notice in verse 22, it says that one king will be a king from them, over them. After the Babylonian captivity, what king was established over Israel when they returned under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah? Who was their king? There wasn't any. There wasn't any. Ezekiel is saying that they are going, that the scattered tribes, the scattered peoples, are going to return, and they are going to have a king over them. Has that verse ever been fulfilled? No.
Then look on, verse 23. And they will no longer defile themselves with their idols or with their detestable things, with any of their transgressions, but I will deliver them from all their dwelling places in which they have sinned, and I will cleanse them, and they will be my people, and I will be their God. There is going to be a purging of idolatry and a cleansing and a spiritual awakening among the people of God, the Jewish people, in this prophecy. It is going to be over a spiritual nation, or it is going to be a spiritual nation that will return. Notice also in verse 24, and my servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd, and they will walk in my statutes and keep in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. Do you see what verse 24 is? The Davidic kingdom is going to be restored. Not only is the Davidic kingdom going to be restored, but in verse 25, and they shall live on the land that I gave to Jacob my servant, in which your fathers lived, and they will live on it, and their sons and their sons' sons forever, and David my servant will be their prince forever. They are going to receive the promised land. What was that promised land? To whom was it promised? To Abraham and to his seed. The Davidic kingdom is going to be restored, and in the restoration of that Davidic kingdom, the land promised to Abraham and his seed is going to be that land. Has that ever been fulfilled? No. Look in history, and you will find nothing like that. And in verses 26 to 28, the Lord will be in the midst of them. And so, when you look at the promise of the Davidic covenant, it is clearly, closely connected with the nation of Israel and the restoration of the nation to the promised land and the spiritual conversion of the nation of Israel. If you look at the chapter and take it in any kind of plain sense, normal language, normal meaning of language, it is clear that this is a prophecy that has not been fulfilled. It is not being fulfilled in this present age. And it really requires a future fulfillment, which is the premillennial scheme. Okay, are there any questions on the Davidic covenant before we go to our third covenant? The new covenant. This is our third primary biblical covenant in the Old Testament that is the foundation for our eschatology. what is the relationship between the new covenant and the previous covenants, particularly the Abrahamic covenant? The Davidic covenant and the new covenant are particular developments of the Abrahamic covenant itself. The Abrahamic covenant is really the foundation covenant. And there are aspects of the Abrahamic covenant which are developed further. What did God say to Abraham? Kings will come forth from you. That's a very general and unspecific statement. What does the Davidic covenant do? It spells that out. It fixes the kingdom and the kingship with the seed of David. We said in the Abrahamic covenant that the promises were not to the unbelieving seed of Abraham, it was to the believing seed of Abraham. Now, what do we have in the new covenant? In the new covenant, we have the spiritual renewal that God is going to bring about in the nation of Israel, that is the groundwork and is necessary for the fulfillment of the promises in the Abrahamic covenant. The promises are to the believing seed, and the new covenant promises that God will bring the nation to a place of spiritual renewal so that the promises of the Abrahamic covenant can be fulfilled. What's our central passage for the new covenant? Jeremiah 31:31. That is the central passage. You can also look in our passage in Ezekiel that we just read, because there it is also talking about the new covenant. You can also look at Isaiah 61 and verses 8 and 9. But the central passage is Jeremiah chapter 31. Now, look at the context of this chapter. Jeremiah chapters 30 to 33 have been called the book of consolation because it is a message of comfort and hope for the future. When you read the book of Jeremiah, I don't know how a person would preach through the book of Jeremiah in consecutive expository messages, taking each one of the prophecies in detail, because it is a wearisome reading, going through chapter after chapter, where Jeremiah is lamenting the sin and the apostasy of the nation of Israel. And he is weeping over their sin. Jeremiah has been called the weeping prophet. And after so many chapters of denunciation of Israel for their sins and an announcement of judgment, the judgment was going to be the Babylonian captivity that came upon the people. After all of this message of sin and judgment, we finally come to the message of hope. And that is what we have here in Jeremiah 30 to 33. It is the message of consolation and hope. In this section, chapters 30 to 33, the high point is our section here on the new covenant in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. God promises a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Now look at the specific things that are said in the new covenant. Verse 31, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." Now, first thing, who is this covenant with? The church.
Right? That's not what it says. It says that this is going to be a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. He is talking about those who are the physical descendants of Abraham. Now, what does he say about the covenant? He says it is a new covenant. A new covenant. Now, the first thing that we need to look at is the significance of this word new. It is new in relationship to what? What was the old covenant? Huh? The Mosaic law. The Mosaic law. The provisions of the new covenant are in contrast to the Mosaic covenant. How do we know that? How do we know that? Now look at Jeremiah. Look at Jeremiah. How do we know that? Verse 32. What does it say? Yes, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, my covenant which they broke. The new covenant is new only in relationship to the Mosaic covenant. It is not in contrast with the Abrahamic covenant. It is not a different covenant that is overthrowing or overturning the Abrahamic covenant or the Davidic covenant. It is going to be a covenant which replaces the Mosaic covenant, but not the other covenants. It is really a further development of our Abrahamic covenant. In Hebrews chapters 8 and verses 7 and 8 says that the very fact that God would make a new covenant shows that the old covenant was deficient. Now, if you look at Hebrews chapter 8, it says this. For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he says. Now, for finding fault. What did God find fault with? It doesn't say that he found fault with the Mosaic covenant. Did you notice that in verse 8? Finding fault with them. The problem was not the Mosaic covenant. Do you know what Paul says about the law in Romans 7? The law was holy and just and good. The problem was not with the law. The law was a revelation of the righteous character of God. The problem was sinful man who could not keep the law. And so, finding fault with them, the fact that God would make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah is an indication that the Mosaic covenant was really not capable of changing the hearts of the people of Israel, and a new covenant would be made, a covenant that would be different from the Mosaic covenant, not like the covenant that I made with them when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the nation of Israel, or of Egypt. Now, what is this covenant going to be like? Notice
it says in verse 33, "This is the covenant which I will make with them, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it." I will write my law, where? On their heart. Where was the Mosaic law written? Yes, on the door frames of the house, but that was not the original covenant. Where was the Mosaic law written?
Wasn't it like on their wrist or on their forehead?
That's what they're supposed to take little parts of. The summary of the heart of the Mosaic law were the Ten Commandments that were written on stone tablets. They were written on stone tablets. This is meant to be a contrast with the Mosaic law written on stone tablets. Here, the law is not going to be written externally on some tablets or some big sign saying, do this or don't do this. It is going to be written on their hearts. What does that mean? It is an indication that there is going to be a change of heart internally, change in the inner nature of men so that they would be capable of obedience. The law is going to be in the heart. That is, it's going to be in the mind, it's going to be in the will, it's going to be in the desire. So what we have here is the difference between an external law code that is imposed upon a people versus the inner change in the heart that will produce that kind of desire for obedience. Now, this is going to be true of the nation, the converted nation of Israel, who will be part of that new covenant. Now, sometimes I think we look at the law and we overlook that even in the Old Testament, you see this kind of change of heart among those who were true believers. Have any of you memorized Psalm 119? Part of it. Well, a lot of people have memorized part of it. Very few people have memorized the whole psalm. William Wilberforce, who was responsible in England for freeing the slaves, he memorized Psalm 119, and when he would walk from his apartment to Parliament, he would recite in the morning all of Psalm 119. But when you look at Psalm 119, what you see there is a true believer in the Old Testament who has internalized God's law. Verse 16, I shall delight in your statutes. Verse 24, your testimonies are my delight. Verse 35, make me walk in the path of thy commandments, for I delight in it. Verse 97, oh, how I love your law. Now, what is the psalmist saying? God had changed his heart. Well, what you see there for an individual in the Old Testament is going to be true of the converted nation under the new covenant. He will put his law in their heart. In verse 33, he says, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. There is going to be a true relationship with God, a personal relationship with God. In verse 34, and they shall not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Now that's a universal knowledge of God, a true
knowledge of God that will be universal. Now, when it says they will know me, that is not just knowing that I exist. The word know is a word that looks at a personal relationship in the Old Testament. Amos chapter 3 and verse 2, God said of Israel, "You only have I known of all of the nations of the earth." Do you see what that word know indicates there? God had a special relationship with the nation of Israel that he did not have with the other nations. It was a personal relationship. And when it says they shall all know me, universally, they will know me, it indicates that there will be that kind of personal relationship. I will be their God. They will be my people. They will know me, and we will have that kind of fellowship together. Yes? Amos 3:2. That's a good verse. You should know that verse. And then look at verse 34. It says, "For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more." Here's the promise of forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness of sins. Sins are going to be done away with. There is going to be free pardon. Now, this is the foundational verse for the new covenant. Why do I say that? Do you notice that word for? What does the word for indicate? Not the result. It's not the result of something. Huh? It's not the purpose of something. It is the reason. It is the ground for something. What does he say? I will be their God. They will all know me. For. This is the reason why these things will be true. I will forgive their sins. So this is really the foundational promise of the new covenant. When you look at the Abrahamic covenant, there is not a lot of stress on sin and forgiveness. The Mosaic covenant was more of a covenant that taught the nation their sin, but the new covenant is a covenant that promises forgiveness. Now, what kind of a covenant is this? Is this a conditional covenant, or is it an unconditional covenant? Yes?
I wanted to ask one question about this universal knowledge of God.
Yes, the question about the universal knowledge of God.
It seems to be talking about just Israel in the context.
Yes, it seems to be talking just about Israel in the context. That is true. Okay?
So where does the universal part come in?
Where does the universal part come in? We'll get to that. But the universal part comes in meaning that it means that all who are in this covenant, all who are in this covenant will have a knowledge of God. As the covenant is made here in Jeremiah, it's just promised to Israel. Okay? And that is one of the crucial questions. How would we in the church who are not Israelites, how would we become related to a part of the new covenant? So we'll deal with that. Okay? Now, I'm saying that this is an unconditional covenant. What's our thesis? The unfulfilled promises of the unconditional covenants require premillennialism. And so therefore, with the new covenant, is it an unconditional covenant? If it is, does it have any promises that have not been fulfilled? And if those promises have not been fulfilled, then they must be fulfilled in the future. If they have not been fulfilled and are not being fulfilled now, they must be fulfilled in the future. Now, this is an unconditional covenant. It is a gracious covenant. Notice how he says it is not like the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant was a conditional covenant, but this covenant is not like the Mosaic covenant. It is a covenant in which God is simply saying, look at verses 31 to 33. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. I will put my law within them. I will be their God. They shall all know me. I will forgive their iniquity. This is what God says I will do. It's God's I will. And what we see here, in the midst of Israel's sin and apostasy, this is the time when the nation of Israel is so corrupt that God is going to send them away into exile, and he is going to bring the historical kingdom of God, the Davidic kingdom, he is going to bring it to an end as far as its historical existence. And what he is saying here is that in spite of their apostasy, I am going to do a work in the nation of Israel in the future that will bring them back to myself, and I will forgive their sins, and I will be their God, and they will all know me. This is a promise of a spiritual future for the nation of Israel. If you look at chapter 30 and verse 3, he says, the days are coming when I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel and Judah. And God is going to bless his people in the future because he is going to bring them to faith and repentance and fulfill his promises to the nation of Israel. But not to the unbelieving nation. It's going to be to the believing part of the nation of Israel. Now, what's the eschatological significance of the Abraham, or the new covenant? Now, who is the covenant with? We have said that it's the same significance as what we had with the Abrahamic covenant and the new covenant, and the Davidic covenant. This is a covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Just as the Abrahamic covenant requires the continued existence of the seed of Abraham, and just as the Davidic covenant requires a people for the son of David to rule over, the kingdom of David, the nation of Israel, so the new covenant guarantees a future for the nation of Israel. It guarantees the future for Israel because the nation of Israel has never been renewed and experienced the promises of the new covenant that are made here through the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 31. Now, when is the new covenant going to be made with the nation of Israel? When is this going to happen? Well, we can look at two passages. We can look at our Jeremiah passage, and then we can also look at a New Testament passage in Romans chapter 11, and both of them converge and show us when the new covenant is going to be fulfilled. In Jeremiah 30 and 31, Jeremiah had promised the captivity, God's judgment for sin. He had also promised that the captivity would last for 70 years and that there would be a return after the 70 years. But in chapters 30 and 31, he is going to go beyond the immediate judgment to the judgment of the day of the Lord. He is going to look at a future judgment at the end of the age. And he is going to go beyond the immediate hope of return that took place after the Babylonian captivity to the end time restoration of the nation of Israel. So Jeremiah had two viewpoints as he was speaking, thus saith the Lord, to the nation of Israel. He had the near viewpoint. For your sin, you are going to be carried into exile, and after 70 years, you are going to return. But there is going to be a larger judgment that will take place at the end of the age. And it is also going to result in a deliverance, but a much greater deliverance. And so what I'm saying is that these chapters go beyond the near view, and they are looking to the end of the age at a time which is still future. Now, look at a couple of things to show this. Verse 3 of chapter 30. The days are coming when I will restore the fortunes of my people, Israel and Judah, and I will bring them back to the land I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. After the Babylonian captivity, who returned? Huh? Judah. Just not all of the nation of Judah, not all of the southern kingdom that was carried into captivity. Some of the nation of Judah, but not the northern kingdom. They did not return after the Babylonian captivity. Notice verses 4 to 7, the time of Jacob's distress. Now these are the words that the Lord spoke concerning Israel and concerning Judah. For thus says the Lord, I have heard a sound of terror, of dread, and there is no peace. Now, this is a vivid description here in verse 6. Ask and see now if a male can give birth. Why do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in childbirth? And why have all faces turned pale? It looks like the men are having labor pains. Alas, for that day is great, and there is none like it. It is the time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. This is looking to the future period of tribulation. This is the day of the Lord. It's the day of Jacob's distress. It is the period of tribulation, the great tribulation at the end of this age. In verses 8 and 9, it says that the Lord declares, I will break the yoke from off their neck and tear off their bonds, and strangers shall no longer make them their slaves. So there's the freedom from bondage. But they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. So you see that we're talking about the time of the restoration of the Davidic kingdom. That's not the post-exilic period when you had the return under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. This is talking about the end times, the future restoration of the Davidic kingdom. Verse 10, you have the restoration of Israel. Do not fear, O Jacob, my servant, declares the Lord. Do not be dismayed, O Israel. For behold, I will save you from afar, and your offspring from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return and shall be quiet and at ease, and no one will make him afraid. Chapter 31 and verse 8.
Behold, I am bringing them from the north country, and I will gather them from the remote parts of the earth. Do you notice that? That is not, I will gather them from Babylon. I will regather them from the remote parts of the earth. In fact, in chapter 31, the beginning of the chapter relates more to the northern kingdom. And so we're talking here not about the regathering from Babylon, but the return from the remote parts of the earth that includes the northern kingdom as well. So these chapters speak of Israel's hope at the end of the age. And that is the time when the new covenant will be established with the nation of Israel. So we're saying, look in the context of Jeremiah 30 to 33. The context here puts this at the end of the age. It's in eschatological times. And it is not taking place here in this age. Now, there's one other passage, and we'll be able to look at this just before we finish class today. Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11. Now, Paul is talking about the present condition of Israel. This is a great problem to him. Christ has come. The gospel has been rejected by and large by the nation of Israel and is now going out to the Gentiles. And Israel seems to be missing out in the great promises of salvation that have been brought by Christ the Messiah. And what does that mean as far as the promises of God? Is God going to keep His word and keep His promises? And Paul is saying here that in the present time, verse 25 of Romans 11, I don't want you to be informed of this mystery, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles comes to an end. At present, what's happening to Israel? They are hardened, and they are rejecting the gospel. And also, at present, who are those who are being saved? This is the time of Gentile salvation. But you notice in verse 25 that Paul says that this hardening of Israel is until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. What's going to happen is that when the full number of Gentiles in God's plan and purpose is completed, the hardening of Israel is going to come to an end. And what will happen then? Look at verse 26. And all Israel will be saved. There is going to be a future salvation of Israel. Now, when will that be? Notice he says in verse 26, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, and he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. What are we talking about here? Isn't that the second advent of Christ? He's talking about a future conversion and salvation of Israel at Christ's second coming, when he will come and he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. There is going to be a future conversion of the nation of Israel. Now, here's our verse. Verse 27, it says, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Now, what is this covenant that's referred to here? It's in connection with the second coming of Christ. It's connected with the future conversion of Israel. Now, what is this covenant that is referred to here in verse 27? What does it say? When I will take away their sins. What covenant that speaks about, is it that speaks about the removal of sin? The new covenant, Jeremiah 31, 34.
And so here, this passage is indicating that the fulfillment of the new covenant to Israel is going to be at the second coming of Christ, when Israel will be converted.